So why do 80s beats hit so hard, and why do we find them so intoxicating even today? Well, making 80s grooves with modern equipment and how to get that huge sound, that's what we're doing today. Hi, I'm Cephalos, and today we're going to get into how to make those 80s sounding drums. Now, 80s drums sound very different from 70s drums, and that happened for several reasons. Multi-tracking got expanded, digital reverbs and digital audio processing techniques just took over, and all of a sudden you can spend lots of time on individual sounds. You could carve them, you could apply all kinds of filtering, and as a result, the sonic landscape of the 1980s vastly expanding. And drums are one of the best examples of that. They started to sound huge. Yes, gated reverb is one big reason. Right, having these massive reverb tails that then all of a sudden disappear. Maybe you can't apply gated reverb with the equipment you have, but there are ways around it if you pay careful attention to the length of reverb tails. So today I'm going to take you to 3 key techniques you need to create those hard-hitting 80s drums. Number 1, we're going to talk about backbeat and syncopation. That snare on 2 and 4 and having a big sound, and then other things dancing around it became a key part of the 80s aesthetic. Number 2, we're going to talk about percussion and call and response, huge legacy of funk and disco, and the drum machines in the 80s like the TR-606 and sample-based machines later on played a huge role, such that those rim shots and claps and claves are all over 80s music, starting with Michael Jackson and ending with Madonna. And finally, compression. Applying compression to individual drum sounds into the overall drum bus became a core technique in the 1980s, and without it, it's hard to imagine how those drums would sound as big as they did. So join me on this ride through the 1980s drums. See you on the other side. So let's get into it. First, a little taste. So here's the little 80s groove that I put together working on my latest track. So let's just listen to the components of drums and how they work with other instruments. Okay, so what's going on here? Let's listen to the drums by themselves. Okay, there's some master processing. We're going to take that off. Now we're just having the raw drum sounds. Let's start with the basic, and that is kick and snare. So as I mentioned, the key rhythmical aspect of 80s beats is the backbeat. The snare, or something like it, hitting on 2 and 4. And the kick drum hitting on 1, but then dancing around or being somewhat syncopated around that snare drum. This really comes from funk. Disco and funk had a massive influence on how drum machines were used in the early 80s. And you can already hear semblance of funk grooves here, especially when we put the hi-hats. So this is already our bass here. We have the strong backbeat, it's pretty loud, and the things dance around the snare on 2 and 4. Okay, going back to the legacy of disco and funk, Latin percussion played a huge role in 1980s grooves. And one reason for that is that it was built in drum machines like the TR-808, 909, and certainly sample-based machines like 707 as well as DMX. So what do we have here in terms of percussion? Well, we have a clave pattern that follows drum and snare closely. Notice that these are working together and they're reinforcing each other, and that's really important that this percussion fits well with the main groove and drives it forward. Let's put the hi-hats back in. The other thing that we want to have in an 80s groove are samples. Sample-based machines became prevalent in the 80s, and taking samples and pitching them weirdly low, like Prince did with LM1 sounds, or weirdly high, allowed folks to get interesting textures. So here's a couple of quintessential 80s type samples that I have here. So this is a vocal sample that's down-pitched, so it sounds very weird. And here's another down-pitched drum sample. So just these two sounds are screaming 80s. So if we put all this together, we have something like this. Actually, let's add bass to it. And of course, you gotta have your synth with a massive core. 80s TV show, anyone? Alright, so that's our syncopation and backbeat. Number 2, percussion. As I mentioned, percussion plays a huge role. And most of the 80s drum machines were equipped with nice sounds. So let's go to the second beat here that plays a role to kind of break up this song. Let's just listen to that. So if we mute all this stuff again, we have the strong beat, and the kick and snare pattern didn't really change. We don't have that clave anymore, but we have this high hit, a bit more disco pattern just to drive it forward in this part of the track. So here this rim shot and claps really provide extra energy and help drive the beat forward. There's also a little synth ostinato. This is an FM synth sound that comes from inside this drum machine, but it just helps enrich the beat. We still have the sample showing up. So notice there's lots of call and response phrases just in the drums. That helps fill out a space and really gives that fun texture to the 80s grooves. Again, one reason this was happening because you started to move from drummers to drum machines. And instead of having endless percussionists and drummers come in and record, you could layer all these percussions using drum machines like the 808 and the 606. So that rhythmic detail is a key part of what you're hearing here. All right, number 3. Compression and saturation. A big change that happened from the music production in the 1970s to 1980s is advent of digital processing, right? For example, digital reverb started to be used in the late 70s, and by the middle 80s, they were fairly inexpensive and they were used in a lot of professional recording studios. In general, single track based processing became more prevalent and you could sculpt individual sounds much more. So what master processing we have here? Let's start with the compression. Compression is a huge part of the 80s sound. So even this sound here has some compression. There's a modern compressor applied on this with a fairly slow attack so that you can hear those transients, but then it lifts the tails of those notes. There's some individual compression applied to the drums themselves. Certainly you want to have compression on these snares. But what I want to focus on is the master compression. So if we listen to this again, now let's put some compression and see how that sounds. So listen to it with and without compression. We're going to add compression gradually. Here's a lot of compression. Notice how the snare becomes bigger and bigger. The reason that happens is that reverb tail of the snare is picked up by the compressor and boosted up. So let's just listen to the snare itself so you can hear that reverb. So again, I have a hefty reverb on the snare. It's not quite a gated reverb, but I tried to time the decay of the reverb to kind of sound gatey, right? It's really important when the reverb tail will end. So if we put the kick back in there, you'll see that it ends sort of at a time to make it rhythmic. So it's really important, even if you don't have a gated reverb, that you spend some time on a length on those reverb tails. But now as we add that compression, now what kind of compression do we have, right? So let's look at that. So it's a fairly slower attack. Now, what happens if the attack is really short, you lose the transients of the drums. So now you get a very squash kick drum. Here we can hear that click a little bit better. Release is not too long because we didn't want a general pumping effect. So if the release is very long, now you get really exaggerated pumping effects. It was important that it's on the shorter side. You can experiment with these settings, and a lot of it has to do with the tempo of the music and adjusting, especially the release time, so that those reverb tails can behave musically. Okay, let's go back to the original groove, and let's look at what's happening with saturation. So I'm going to decrease this compression a little bit. Okay, there's no saturation being applied here. Let's turn it on. So what's happening here? Okay, a couple of things. Really, the saturation that's being applied is a sort of pretty classic noisy one. I also have a little EQ here. But notice that it's not applied evenly to the whole mix because there's this envelope follower, which also de facto acts as a compressor, right? So basically, I set a certain sensitivity here, such as that the drive saturation that's being applied to this unit is not applied or applied less when the envelope followers is triggered. And specifically, the point here was to remove some of the saturation applied to the kick, so the kick kind of stays relatively clean. So you'll notice here that I set this to a very low frequency and fairly narrow width, such as that thing's pretty much about 150 or 200 hertz, less drive is going to be applied. Let's see how it sounds when that's not happening. So now the saturation is applied evenly to all the drums. But if I decrease the drive on the kick will stay clean while the other higher end percussion gets a little grit. To me, that has a little bit more of the classic 80s sound, even though the compression, saturation, or kick drum, certainly in hip hop and lots of genres, played a critical role. Once you put it all together, sounds something like this. So I really hope this helps you hone in how to make those 80s style drums that are so fun and hit so hard even in 2026. See you on the other side.